Good afternoon, and welcome to the Midwest Flooding, the year's biggest U.S. disaster webinar. This is Regine Webster, Vice President at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. This webinar is co-sponsored by Foundation for Louisiana, the Iowa Council on Foundations, the Kansas Association of Community Foundations, the Minnesota Council on Foundations, the Mississippi Alliance of Nonprofits and Philanthropy, the Wisconsin Philanthropy Network, the Council of Foundations, Native Americans in Philanthropy, Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Funders, and the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities. A few reminders before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and the link will be emailed to all of you after the webinar. Use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you have a question. Anytime you have a question, just pop it right into that Q&A box. We lovingly ask you not to use the chat box, so use the Q&A box. And if you're on Twitter, please go ahead and use our hashtag CDP4Recovery to share the discussion. To begin with, I want to go ahead and actually review our goal takeaways for the webinar. We often write this up in our own scripting, but don't often share them with everybody. But we decided we thought we would just share. So today we would love for all of you who are listening to leave with 3 takeaways. First, an understanding of the extent and impact of flooding to date, and an awareness of upcoming flood risks in the winter and spring. Second, we'd like you to leave with clear direction on what philanthropists should do now and in the next several months to help the recovery process. And lastly, we very much hope that you leave with a sense of urgency around the magnitude of these disasters and the need to do something to support the relief and recovery efforts. I'm going to start also by providing some background on the flooding that we've experienced this year. So far in 2019, there have been 10 $1 billion disasters across the United States. Of these, 3 are flood related. The first is the Missouri River and North Central flooding that occurred in mid to late March. The second is Mississippi River flooding in the Midwest and Southern area of the U.S. Again, mid-March all the way to the end of July. And then lastly, Arkansas River flooding from May 20th to June 14th. FEMA has issued at least 13 declarations related to flooding, including several states and a few travel declarations. Most of these stem from March's bomb cyclone combined with ongoing river flooding on the Missouri, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Ohio rivers, as well as smaller tributaries. Yet flooding continues and communities are not always eligible for assistance. To update us on current emergencies across much of the area and what funders can do to help, we've got with us today the following speakers. First is Nancy Beers. Nancy is the director of the Midwest Early Recovery Fund at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, which focuses on supporting vulnerable populations following a disaster in 10 states across the Midwest. Dr. Dennis Todey is the director of the United States Department of Agriculture Midwest Climate Hub in Ames, Iowa. The hub delivers actionable climate information for agriculture in an 8-state region over most of the Corn Belt. Dr. Eric Tate is an associate professor at the University of Iowa in the Department of Geographical and Sustainability Sciences. He teaches and conducts research in the areas of flood hazards, water resources, environmental justice, and social vulnerability, using geospatial indicators to explore interactions among environment and society. And then lastly, Sara works in community development and corporate philanthropy at First National Bank of Omaha. In this role, she's part of a team responsible for the bank's philanthropic activities and nonprofit partner relationship management. Welcome to all of you, and thank you all so much for taking the time out of your work to speak with us today. I'm going to go ahead and start popping a few questions over to our speakers, and I know that they've got lots to say on this topic. So let's start with Nancy. Nancy, you cover a 10-state area, most of which were hit hard this spring with the bomb cyclones, tornadoes, and floods. Can you give us an update on what has happened since March and what's happening now?
Thank you, Regine, and good afternoon, everyone. It's been busy, right? We have been busy. Who's ever heard of a bomb cyclone? I've lived in the Midwest for a very long time. First time I've ever heard of a bomb cyclone. And in March, it devastated parts of the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, where we've been very active for the last 4 years. They've had a disaster every year since we began the program in 2015, and made many parts of the Pine Ridge Reservation inaccessible for months. Then in Nebraska, devastated central and the more eastern part of Nebraska, and then certainly went into western Iowa with severe flooding and extreme climate challenges, cattle trapped in fields, and roads and bridges, and many of those communities stayed underwater for a very long time. Here we have a map that was put out by the New York Times in September, which shows that, hey, we are getting some attention, even though sometimes when you live in the Midwest, we feel like no one's really ever talking about us. But the map, if you get a chance to go and access this, is fascinating. The map you're seeing on your left is a motion map. You can actually see the white line where the river is supposed to be, and then as you visually look at this, you can see how it has expanded over time and gone way over its banks. The other side of the map on your right-hand side is all of the rivers that have hit major flood stage in our region since September. So it's been very impactful, and it's been pretty incredible. Next slide. So we've seen damage here. We talked about the bomb cyclone on your far upper left-hand corner in the Niobrara River in Nebraska. That's ice jams that had hit a restaurant and devastated it. So it wasn't just the snow; it was all of this change that was taking place with this wind and weather and the melting and the rain. This is the Pine Ridge Reservation, certainly Iowa, and then also parts of North Dakota were impacted. You can read this yourself, of course, but the bomb cyclone was like a hurricane, Category 1 or 2 hurricane that was 1,000 miles wide, and stayed in the region for quite some time. Next slide, please. It's been long lasting. So, the bomb cyclone was bad enough, right? But here we go. It just didn't end. And it's been continuing all year. I actually live in Minnesota on the Iowa border, and we have had rain constantly. It looks pretty here. It looks a little bit like the Garden of Eden, but unfortunately, it also means that all our rivers and streams and our ground is completely saturated. The Arkansas River, of course, in April. In Jefferson City, Missouri, we had a major tornado, also followed by floods. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, in June, there was a major tornado followed by floods. Kearney, Nebraska, unfortunately, the floods of the bomb cyclone devastated central and eastern Nebraska, but unfortunately in July, the more western part of Nebraska was also flooded in Kearney. We saw flooding and a tornado in South Dakota, and then certainly the flooding continues in Iowa. Next slide. I'm not gonna give you a lot of weather information. I work on recovery and helping people rebuild their lives, but to put some context around this, and we'll have others, Dennis and others on this webinar that will give you a much better climate information than I can. But it's just been such an incredibly different year. I've lived in the Midwest most of my life. I worked the disasters of the Red River Valley disasters of 1997, multiple floods in the 2000s, and the 2008 flood that was certainly epic in our region. And if you live here, we all talk about those records that were set then. What's really different for me this year and what I've seen is that, yes, the disaster is prolific, the flooding is prolific, but it never ended. And we've had water constantly in our region. I just drove over the Mississippi River about a week ago. I've never seen it so high without major flooding, right? I mean, it's up to the concrete barriers underneath the bridges. And yesterday, I was driving home across the river in Minnesota, the Minnesota River in Minnesota, again, as far as it can stretch without you know, impacting homes, very, very high, as close to the top of the bridge as I've seen it probably ever. So even though in many of our areas we haven't actually seen damage to infrastructure yet or to homes yet, you can see that there's something unique going on because the water isn't going down. And my gosh, it's the end of October here. We've had the wettest Midwest winter since 1895 in 2018, and we've had the wettest 12-month span on record from 2018 to April of 2019. And that only goes until 2019 because it's completely, it's been raining ever since then as well. The Mississippi crest was just short of the 1993 level. These are numbers and dates that we all, if we live here, know well. The Arkansas River again hit record levels, and in the record at Morriltown in Arkansas had stood since the Great Flood of 1927. During the first, and this is the thing that concerns us the most right now, is during the first 2 weeks of September, the Missouri River Basin had 400% more rainfall than average, and North Dakota has the highest recorded river levels for October on record due to heavy September rainfall. And then of course, if you live here, we also know we had a blizzard in early October. Go ahead, next. This is the slide that concerns me the most. For those of you who don't know, when it says an IA declaration in yellow, what that means is that FEMA has come to these states. The governor of a state asks the president for a declaration, and FEMA comes and evaluates the damage, and they determine what kind of declaration you're going to get. A PA declaration, those are in blue on your map. That means that the government, FEMA, the federal government has agreed to pay 75% of the costs, the public costs of responding to a disaster, and the state or the county, depending on what state you live in, will pay the additional 25%. That can run into the millions and millions of dollars. So that's the lowest level of a declaration. The highest level of declaration is called an IA declaration, and that means individual assistance. So that means that the federal government FEMA is going to come in and set up offices where people can apply for grants to rebuild their homes, not businesses, but homes. You can see on the far right, in 2017 and 18, our region only had a total of individual assistance registrations of a little under 3,000. And this year alone, as of 10/18, we had almost 24,000 applications. It's a little bit higher than that. I saw that information earlier today. You can see where they are. I think the surprise on this map should be not maybe Nebraska, because we all heard about Nebraska, but so many of us didn't realize that Oklahoma had been so impacted. Even I, who follow this every day, had no idea that it had been impacted so much. What this map does not show, which is equally disturbing, is all of the counties that haven't been declared IA. And there are many of those counties, because oftentimes it's because they just don't have enough population in those counties. Many of our counties only have between 3, 4, 5, 6,000 people in them. So even if most of the county was impacted, oftentimes it's not enough to get an IA declaration. Next. So just for the numbers of their, if you look at our region, almost 63% of our counties in the entire region have an IA or a PA declaration. 7.4 million people live in IA declared counties. 25% of the total population of our 10 states live in IA declared counties, which I already told you are very hard to get, so that's significant. And 61.4 of Nebraskans live in an IA declared, 47.8 in Oklahoma, and 42.5 in Missouri. And this is just sort of a bit of interesting information. The 211 calls for disaster assistance in South Dakota have increased by nearly 2,000%, and in Nebraska almost by 3,000%. So it just shows how many people have been stranded and are seeking help after this epic flooding we've seen this year. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go over this too quickly. You can look at it later, but you know, we've had livestock was lost, especially in the bomb cyclone. Unplanted crops, you know, I know Dennis will cover this more later, but significant. Stored grain, I think this is an interesting story in Fremont County, Iowa, after the bomb cyclone, much of the stored grain was lost. And just in that one county, they lost $7.3 million of stored grain. The challenge there is that stored grain does not covered by crop insurance. So that's just a loss to the farmers. The infrastructure, 51 levees in Missouri, protecting over $300 million worth of property had been breached. And many small and rural counties and reservations have been unable to match that 25%. It's a real challenge for small counties. A lot of counties don't have much tax revenue. There's just not enough people to do that. And on reservations, of course, there's no money either. So sometimes they don't end up with aren't able to have the match from the federal government. And then I-29 which runs from Kansas City to the Canadian border, has been shut down 4 times, which impacts tourism, impacts economy, impacts people being able to go to work. And then you can read this later, but this LinkedIn report is interesting because it shows that people are migrating and are having to leave the area to get jobs, which is really disturbing in the Midwest because we are trying to hang on to every single person who lives there. Next. So the economic impact is still unknown. We don't really know a lot of stuff, but what's really disturbing is we're going into fall with heavily saturated ground and rivers at record levels. And what concerns someone like me is recovery is just beginning for many families. We had so much rain in September and October, but even some of those families that were impacted in July and August haven't been able to access enough resources to get their homes rebuilt. But in the Midwest, winter is coming. And so people cannot live in the Midwest without electricity and furnaces and heat. And so that's on my heart every day. And we're expected to have a pretty wet winter. Next. So just to wrap up, you know, the Midwest Early Recovery Fund, we give grants to build local capacity. So this year we've been able to give out $1.3 million. We've got a little bit left that we'll be granting out to Catholic Charities of Northwestern, Missouri, to do case management. You can see most of our grants are around mental health, disaster case management, legal aid, and reconstruction. So there's so much to do. There's so much left to do. We've personally barely made a dent, but we are really trying to prepare for what's coming and making sure that we can stabilize some of these communities as quickly as we can right now to make sure that who's been impacted now can get help before we see what happens next spring. Next. So there's my contact information. If you have any questions, please just email me, and hopefully we'll have some more information on this as the winter and spring progresses. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks so much, Nancy. It's so helpful to set the context for what you've seen and the stats over the past several months. For all of you Game of Thrones fans out there, I will say I did appreciate, Nancy, when you said winter is coming. So without further ado, I'd love to turn the mic over to Dennis, please. You know, adding on to what Nancy shared, can you talk to us about the flooding this year and the impacts, especially on the agricultural side? And I think you also have some insights about what winter and spring of 2019 and 2020 are preparing for us. So we'd love to hear about that as well.
Right, we're going to touch on all those things very quickly. Nancy took some of my chunks of information already, so that's we'll put a little more context around this, and then talk about what we know going ahead for the rest of the fall, winter, and looking at the next spring. Let's go to the next slide. This is a slide that I showed when we talked this spring. This is a graphic from NOAA looking at the last 3 months up through April, the last 6 months up through April on the right-hand side, last 12 months up through April, that show the ranking of precipitation for each of those periods. The darkest green, those states had the wettest of that time period on record. and then the various shades of green go from much above average to above average. So the start of this there's no time you can say as a start, but this began all the way last fall. We got very wet last fall, some even last summer of 2018, that preset this situation. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I've got the same set of maps here, but these go through September now. So last 3 months going into September, the last 6 months going into September on the right, and then the bottom left is the last 12 months. And you see a very similar pattern throughout the upper Midwest. The 3 month period, July through September, wettest on record for the Dakotas. Other states, up there in top 5, top 10. Last 6 months, South Dakota was the wettest. And then the last 12 months through September, South Dakota and Wisconsin are the wettest. So if you look at the whole drainage basin, Mississippi, Missouri, and associated rivers, you see what the situation is. Just quickly pointing out the Southeast, in contrast, was incredibly dry during this time period. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Where that puts us, and Nancy kind of alluded to this, we still have a huge amount of water throughout the upper Midwest. The graphic on the right-hand side shows data from USGS on stream gauges where we are right now. If a dot is in black, that is the highest on record at this time of year, and you see lots of those. Anything that is in blue is higher than the 90th percentile. So almost all the Dakotas, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, parts of Nebraska, Kansas, and Montana, all the stream flows are well above average for this time of year. In fact, we have set record all-time stream flows from that September rainfall in parts of South Dakota and parts of Minnesota. Typically, we think of flooding as springtime. These were all-time record flows that were being set in September. So that gives you an idea where we are. And what happens to this is this can drain out at this point, but it's not going to drain out fast enough. We're still going to have a lot of this water all around for much of the winter. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Connected with this, where are we in the way of soil moisture? This is data from a group at NOAA also. The upper left-hand side is where soil moisture is, the anomaly compared to average. These are in millimeters, so you divide them by 25 to get inches. So you have several inches above average soil moisture. So we have very wet soils going in. If you want to look at it on a percentile basis, from 1 to 100, anything that's in green is in the 80th to 90th percentile, and the blue areas are wettest, would be 100th percentile, wettest on record. So again, very wet soils. And wet soils don't dry out during the winter time. They can drain of excess moisture if they're not frozen. Once they're frozen, they're locked in, and that's the way it's going to be for the rest of winter. They can drain, but they will not dry out. You have nothing actively growing, and temperatures are not warm enough to dry out the surfaces. So we know going into next year we're going to have very wet soils in addition to the other moisture related to this. Go ahead to the next slide. So that is what is presetting our situation, knowing what we're dealing with going into next year. What has happened on the ag side because of this? On the lower left-hand side is where we are on corn harvest progress, and the upper right-hand side, soybean progress. The top number, which is a little bit hazy in some of these, is what percent has been harvested in each state. The number below it is how many percent behind we are. The numbers to focus on nationally here: corn, 41% harvested, that is 20% behind average. Soybeans, 62%, 16% behind average. Part of this is related to the wet conditions in the spring. We had very slow progress in planting, so crop development and harvesting is late. And then because of the very wet conditions, if you have very wet soils, you should not, or in some cases may not even be able to get out and get them out of the field in this situation. 2 to 2.5 weeks behind average. We're probably going to have crops that are going to be not able to be harvested until soils freeze, or not even at all. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Because of the situation. On top of this, in addition to the wetness, we had our first big blizzard already, the second week of October, mostly North Dakota, some South Dakota, where we had 20 to 30 inches on top of unharvested crops. That's not a good situation. Even if the crops aren't aren't knocked down because of the wind and snow. That we've added much more wetness. Now, most of this snow has melted, but that just adds to the moisture conditions. Most of this either drains to the Red River of the north, that goes north into Canada, or to the James River, which eventually ends up in the Missouri. The James River, there's concern that it may not go below flood stage for, even all the way into next year sometime. These have been coupled also with very strong winds. Strong winds can help knock down crops as we're going along here. All right, next slide, please. So our impacts, again, slow harvest season, we have delayed crop maturity, wet soils, and down crops because of wind and some of the snow. Some of these may not be able to be harvested until the spring because the soils are either too wet. If they're lucky enough, soils will freeze, they can get the crop out before that point. So we still don't know what our whole crop situation is going to look like. We also had a situation where, because of the delayed planting, we had crops that weren't quite mature yet that froze. Here's a picture of one of those. This is in Missouri even, soybeans that were not mature, but this is a fairly frequent situation all around the region. Go ahead to the next slide, please. What this has meant in the way of crop losses, this is a map of indemnities paid by USDA Risk Management Agency, basically places where they paid out indemnities already. And you can see the worst hit areas all around the region. The Eastern Dakotas were some of the worst areas, places where we call prevent plant, mainly crops that were not able to be not able to be planted, prevent plant. They've received their settlement from RMA already. The counties in the darkest, over $10 million in indemnity payments in those areas. So the Eastern Dakotas, down along the Missouri River, and then parts of Northern Illinois, Northwest Ohio were the worst hit areas this year, but there are many areas that were impacted also. In fact, at this point, some of the issues related to this, North Dakota has declared a state of emergency because of the flooding and because of the ag issues. Their governor and Secretary of Ag were doing several meetings around to do listening sessions and talk to producers about what's going on. Next slide, please. On the flooding side, you've heard about some of the issues already. Many flood stages. Freeze up is not far off. The cold that's setting into us is going to be lasting into November, much colder than average. That has folks like the Corps of Engineers very concerned because they're still trying to draw down reservoirs and evacuate some of the water. If we start freezing that up, that's going to limit their ability to draw those down and carry over some of these problems even more than we know we're going to have into next year. Nancy mentioned the Missouri River levees already, that because of the wet this year, the Corps has continued to try to draw down the reservoirs to regain flood storage capacity. That has not allowed the levees to be repaired this year. Only some minor repairs have been able to make happen because of this. Next slide. And then that puts us in a situation now with where we are looking at next year. And this is what has NOAA and a number of our partners concerned. These are outlooks from NOAA's Climate Prediction Center. And these are precipitation outlooks for November through January, the next 3-month period, all the way. And then they have additional ones. The one on the right is from February to April. And the green areas have increased chances for above average precipitation. Now, the probabilities here are not big increases, so we're not saying absolutely it's going to be very wet this winter, but given the overall wet conditions, any kind of even near average precipitation, let alone above average precipitation, has people very concerned. Because additional water in the basin and all these river basins is not going to help the situation. It's going to exacerbate already existing conditions, to add to flooding, and it could potentially add to agricultural issues on top of this. We mentioned already some of the agricultural issues. The other problem we have with the agricultural issues, there is crop insurance that has covered some of these losses, but it doesn't cover all the losses. And right now, commodity prices are not at a level where people are able to make much money anyway. So we have additional stress problems, not only from flooding, from agricultural issues. All these have added up to add to the overall stress conditions. So this is what has people very concerned. The overall confidence in these outlooks is not great because there's not an El Nino or La Nina. But again, any additional level of risk it has us very concerned about what we're looking at for next year. And that wraps up my part. We'll hand it off to the next.
Dennis, thank you so much. Those slides are kind of, okay, that's funny. A funny photo. Thank you for that. The slide on the crop losses is unbelievable amongst all of your other slides as well. So thank you so much for that. Let's go ahead and turn our attention now to Eric. Eric, like those of us over here at CDP, your work really focuses on vulnerable populations. In your research, who have you found is most vulnerable to floods?
Thank you. You can advance to the next slide. This is a picture of Pacific Junction in Iowa, on the western edge of Iowa. And so, you know, we can look at photos like this and see all the water and the impacted buildings and maybe think about crops. But as a social vulnerability researcher, when I see this, I tend to think about the people that are impacted by these disasters. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today on more of sort of a national scale. Next slide, please. And so what is this thing about social vulnerability to hazards? What is it? Essentially, it's that, you know, the economic structure, the social structures, political structures in our country lead, you know, some groups of people to be persistently more vulnerable, susceptible to hazards than others. And so this slide has, you know, some general characteristics of populations. Now this does not occur, this is not for individuals, this is for groups of people and tendencies, but reasons who the most vulnerable are and how they tend to be the most vulnerable. And this is work that applies pretty much to all hazards. But I'm going to drill down to floods in a bit. Next slide, please. Well, a lot of work is taking these characteristics of vulnerable populations and link that with demographic variables from the US Census, and can make models of social vulnerability to hazards. And so here you're looking at the resulting map of such a social vulnerability index at the county scale in the United States. The general idea is that if you can measure this, then you can start managing social vulnerability, just like you might use measures of how much water's in the stream or crop losses, you know, these numeric estimates of impact for these other dimensions. But there's really good reasons for us to also be focusing on the people and the vulnerable people that are affected. In general, are the least responsible for the impacts, but also then have the fewest resources to cope. And, you know, taking off my scientist hat, I would say it's also the morally right thing to do. Next slide, please. So, you know, one of the things I look at a lot is like, who's the most vulnerable to floods? So I'm going to show you some results, some really recent results for sort of national level analyses. This is from National Academy of Sciences that just produced this report in March. And one of their, you know, findings from that is that, you know, the impacts tend to fall most disproportionately on the most vulnerable populations. And in large part because they tend to reside in the most flood-prone areas as well. And so this can affect, you know, beforehand resources for flood mitigation, trying to reduce future impacts, but also fewer resources in the recovery from floods. Next slide, please. And so this is a result of some research that one of my graduate students is doing. We got a national floodplain map that just came out like a year ago. And so we wanted to understand, okay, where are the places that both flooding, river flooding, and social vulnerability, modeled social vulnerability is really high. And so we broke it into 4 categories here. In the red, you see places where it's both high flood hazard and high social vulnerability. Orange, low flood hazard, high social vulnerability, and you can read the legend for the other categories. But the general notion is, what if we could focus on the places that are high in both dimensions? Maybe that's one way, or thinking about these categories from these multiple dimensions for understanding and focusing our resource distribution. And so next slide, please. Taking that map, what do we know about these places that are both high flood hazard and high social vulnerability? I'm going to point you to the bar graph on the left. Essentially, the first 2 bars is showing that there's around 15 million people that live in these places. So it's not a small number of people that, you know, have both high flood hazard and have fewer, sorts of resources and capacities to deal with it. The second set is this high-low, places that have high flood hazard but low social vulnerability. But there's lots of times where we've had rapid demographic change in this country. So, if such change results in increasing vulnerability, then you've got another 15 million people that could be in deep trouble. But the third set is the low-high. Low flood hazard, high social vulnerability. And certainly with climate change and increasing intensification of the hydrologic cycle, over 30 million people, if some of these places become more susceptible to flood hazards, we could have a real problem. And so in these places that are both high in both dimensions, what are some of the dominant characteristics? The table on the right shows the top 6 that shows it's mostly, economic characteristics around wealth and income, race and family structure, where you have the biggest differences between places that are high in both dimensions and everywhere else. Next slide, please. So another question is, okay, if you drill down on flood recovery, how equitable is that? If we agree that the vulnerable deserve extra attention, are they getting it through federal, at least, sources of recovery assistance? And so here's some just results of some just studies that have come out in the last year. The study on top essentially saying that the places that have the largest amount of damages, it's also sort of intertwined with high rates of wealth inequality. And the second one on the bottom is talking about, flood acquisitions or buyouts as a strategy to reduce future impacts and to help people recover. But it's essentially finding that places where the counties where these buyouts are happening, the buyouts themselves are concentrated in places with areas of higher social vulnerability. This might sound right, but then it's also like maybe some of these places are being targeted to make available for further development, for example. But also the counties themselves need to have enough sort of wealth and technological expertise to apply for this. People can't just apply for these buyouts themselves. And so in Western Iowa, there's a lot of discussion, should the counties open this up by applying, but then they're gonna lose a lot of tax base. Next slide, please. FEMA has done a study on the affordability of the National Flood Insurance Program and found that it's essentially locking out a lot of households and individuals that are low income, even though these folks they tend to reside in high flood hazard areas more. Next slide. Lastly, this is a study that we just did in South Carolina looking at all of these different programs from the FEMA individual assistance that Nancy talked about earlier, and onward to the HUD disaster community development block grant program. Essentially what we found is that the money's mostly going to households that have a high lot of damage, but not necessarily within those going to households that have high social vulnerability. And you can see from the maps, the third one is the National Flood Insurance Program. This is South Carolina, has the most amount of resources given, but the counts of the people that are eligible for that are much lower than, for example, FEMA individual assistance, which is much higher, but very low overall rates of assistance, or sorry, dollar amounts of assistance per person, per household. Next slide, please. So one strategy is to empower flood survivors. Okay, this is a quote from Harriet Festing, The Higher Ground, that there are groups of residents and people that are interested in this, but if they're seeing dollars go to increasing vulnerability for projects led by developers, they can become cynical. So I think we could do more to empower flood survivors and groups of flood survivors. Next slide, please. And so I'll close here on 3 strategies. One, sort of disaggregating impacts by geography and populations. It's not just, you hear these stories of disaster impacts. Well, there was $10 million of damage or these kinds of things, but who is being impacted by them? Where are these impacts? And you can also ask the same questions about where disaster recovery dollars are spent. And, thinking about, supporting flood survivors, certainly there's a lot of great organizations, but I think one that's not been getting as much attention are these so-called connector organizations that have lots of technological expertise that can connect with local flood survivors. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eric. Again, lots of compelling imagery and such clear statistics and facts that really help put this all together in our own minds. So I appreciate that a ton. Sara, over to you. You work for a bank, the First National Bank of Omaha. Why did a bank get involved in responding to the flooding, and what'd you do? And in particular, we definitely want to hear about the recovery funders convenings that you've been taking part in.
Great. Yes, thank you. So really for us, it was simple. We got involved because it was the right thing to do. We have a 160-year history and really an organizational culture that's really built around doing what's right for our customers and our employees and all the communities in which we serve. We are headquartered here in Omaha, Nebraska, and we have operations in 7 states, including the flood-impacted areas in Nebraska and southeastern South Dakota, and then also in western Iowa. And as we saw that damage and destruction, we knew we needed to help our neighbors. In fact, many of the images that you'll see in the slides are actually taken by our own employees of their homes and other areas in their communities. And you'll see that it really indicates that compelling need. So supporting our communities in this way really aligns with the way we traditionally operate our philanthropic support programs and really prioritize housing and economic and community development. So really we took a 2-phased approach after the flooding in the spring. The first phase involved deploying an initial disbursement to really address those immediate emergency needs. And then the second phase was approaching one of our longstanding and trusted partners, the Nebraska Community Foundation. And we worked with them to create an affiliated fund called the Rebuild the Heartland Community Fund. And what was really remarkable about that was their ability to establish that fund and begin accepting donations immediately, which really turned out to be a key component for us because we know that the majority of funding received after a disaster is in those initial weeks. So I think it's the most of the funding is received in weeks 1 through 4. And then by month 6, research would tell us that the funding traditionally has stopped. So establishing that immediately was really critical. The bank provided an initial investment in that and some matching funds, and really it was a wonderful thing to watch because our employees and our customers and our business partners and others in the community were incredibly generous. We had even a local advertising agency that created much of the collateral that you see in the slides. They did that for us at no cost. So after we established that fund, it gave us a minute to kind of pause and breathe and take time to really understand the extent of the damage, including where philanthropy could play a role. And we needed to create a strategy to address those longer term rebuilding needs, which obviously existed long after this was no longer something that was we saw every day in the news. So during that time, we found ourselves, the fund found themselves the beneficiary of some really interesting events. We had, including a yoga festival and a virtual run, and it really, we received funding from people and organizations all across the country who believed in what we were doing and wanted to help. And I think, throughout our involvement with this, there were 3 really important learnings that occurred. And I'd like to thank Nancy because she imparted a lot of her knowledge and wisdom on us, sharing best practices in disaster philanthropy. And we also learned from some others who had done this work. So the 3 things that really stood out to us were, number 1, the importance of really being patient while the communities identified their needs. There is an appropriate time for philanthropy to plug in. And even though in some cases we received some pressure to get moving, we had a good case for needing to wait. The second thing is really the importance of working through the long-term recovery groups. And those are the cooperative groups made up of the local representatives in a community that help individuals and families recover and rebuild. So having their presence and working through those groups who really have a sense and a pulse on what the community needs is incredibly important. And then third, really the value of collaborations with other funders and organizations. Our kind of theme or our mantra was we wanted to reduce the burden on our communities and on organizations while maximizing the impact of our philanthropy. So something that was incredibly valuable to us was a local partner here, our Omaha Community Foundation, had convened, and they're still convening, regular and frequent meetings with local philanthropists who all really feel compelled to do something in response to the floods. None of us had really ever done this before, so we all learned and have learned pretty fast. But it's really a great way for this group of individuals and organizations and foundations to ensure that we all have the same data, because I think what we found was there was very sporadic information being kind of thrown back and forth, and we really needed a place to house that and aggregate it and make sure that we're all working and operating from essentially the same playbook. It also really gave us access and the ability to talk to the same experts at once, which really minimized the duplication on everyone and enabled an efficient way for us to share information. And I think what's really been fantastic to see as part of this funders collaborative is how each funder has aligned on a disaster response or rebuilding continuum, meaning certain funders were interested in emergency response, so they've gotten in really early. Others have kind of plugged in at building up those infrastructure or that infrastructure of the long-term recovery groups who are leading that long-term rebuilding activity. And then we have others who want to plug in funding the activities of those groups. And then lastly, those who are really looking at that even longer term resilience and mitigation efforts and funding that activity. So everyone has found a place for themselves to plug in. We're all aware of that, which really reduces that duplication and maximizing impact. And I think, had we been operating separately in different silos, I can speak for the Rebuild the Heartland Community Fund and saying our road would have been much windier and longer. So we're very grateful for the work of the Omaha Community Foundation for convening the Funders Collaborative, and our communities ultimately will be better off for them having done so.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I really appreciate it. Can you tell us what that picture is on the right that we're all looking at right now?
What slide are you on?
Oh, what slide? I'm on slide, it says 48. It looks
sure.
like there's 3 people in gloves huddled around some brick-looking items.
Yes, so it turns out that is a picture from one of our employees, and she was her family's historian. So she had many different VHS tapes and other forms of really their family's history and documentation. And so these volunteers from the bank were helping to, I'm not sure exactly what method they used, but they were helping to dry out those tapes to see if there was any way that they could be salvaged.
Oh, that's amazing. That's incredible. Well, I'm looking at the questions in our Q&A box right now, and one theme that I see emerging is a question about philanthropic strategies. So if I could actually pose this to all of you, what philanthropic strategies do you think are important at this time? Again, knowing what we know about the here and now, as well as what has been portended to come. Nancy, you go first.
Sure. Okay. Well, first, I'm hoping that all of you who are listening today that have not, are from the Midwest or from anywhere really, that haven't been flooded yet or didn't know about this, that not only are you listening to the needs that we are seeing today, and they're significant. So I don't want us all to just only look forward. I want us to make sure that everyone is still concerned about those almost 6,000 applications in Oklahoma, and how so many counties in Missouri and Iowa haven't really even hardly started their recovery, because some of these places have been flooded for months, and the water still hasn't gone down, and we're going into winter. But for those of you who haven't even started to fund or haven't really been thinking about this yet, I'm hoping that you will prepare a strategy at your organization, what you might do in the spring if what's predicted actually does happen. Prepare for the worst and hope for the best. Prepare for that. Meet with your board and see where they'd be interested. Sara did such a great job of talking about how all of these foundations came together and decided on what their priorities were going to be. It takes a patchwork of people. It takes a patchwork of organizations to complete a community's recovery. And I'm so impressed with Nebraska because they did this almost organically without very much help. There's a lot of smart people in Nebraska, and they were able to, there was no competition going on. There was no competition, well, we'll take that one or this one. They saw it as a really big problem and started deciding who was going to solve what problem. So prepare for, don't forget about the needs of these communities now. If you're connected to any of these 10 states, try to investigate a little further on what the needs are, but certainly with a forward-looking lens, start preparing for what might come.
Dennis, what about you? What strategies for philanthropists would you offer?
I'll pass on that question.
Okay, Eric, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I mean, just kind of what I was discussing before is that, if we can find, these kinds of events are likely to be happening more and more. And so finding ways for philanthropy not only to support sort of reactive, assistance, but also sort of proactive assistance in ways that households and groups of households and areas and communities can collectively act in supporting those groups, I think is sort of a gap.
And Sara, anything on your end to add?
Yeah, I think that the advantage that philanthropy has in this situation is the flexibility and the ability to really move quickly and a lot more nimbly than a lot of our federal and state agencies. And so, there's a lot of power in that. And I think in our case, it was really sort of waiting. That waiting period was so crucial to enable those LTRGs to establish and build their infrastructure. But, I think at a time like this, really all strategies are so valuable. Anything that you can offer and provide to some of these communities, many of which have little to no resources available to them to really build. And so I think that there are many different ways to get involved and really build up these communities that are so hurting so badly.
That is great. Thank you all. I appreciate that. We know from previous experience that the focus of most individual giving is on the immediate relief phase. But as our panelists have shared, there's just going to be ongoing needs to assist with recovery for many years to come. And you can all find more information about disaster philanthropy at www.disasterphilanthropy.org. And to those of you who may be planning disaster response funding, CDP has many additional resources and information in our Disaster Philanthropy Playbook. You can find that at www.disasterplaybook.org. And several of you have asked for contact information for our speakers, and I will say this with as much authority as I can muster, that should be available to you when we send out our follow-up email to you all with the presentation and the link to the recording. We can make that available. We've also at CDP have created a list of suggestions for foundations to consider related to disaster giving that we want to share with you as takeaways today. The first is really to take the long view. Even while focusing on immediate needs, remember that it will take some time for the full range of needs to emerge. Please be patient in planning for disaster funding. We just know that recovery will take a long time and that funding will be needed throughout. Secondly, recognize that there are places private philanthropy can help that government agencies might not. Private funders have opportunities to develop innovative solutions to help prevent or mitigate future disasters that the government cannot execute. And in fact, I saw one of the questions that we didn't get a chance to get to, the consideration about resilience. Private funders really have a solid angle to look toward resilience and look toward mitigating future disasters. Third, this is something that we've said about philanthropy and about disaster funders since the day that CDP was born, is that all funders are disaster philanthropists. Even if your organization does not work in a particular geographic area or fund immediate response efforts, you can look for ways to tie disaster funding to your existing mission. If you focus on education, health, children, or vulnerable populations, disasters present prime opportunities to support those critical areas. And then lastly, we encourage you to ask the experts. There's, not in addition to Nancy and Dennis and Eric and Sara on this call, if you're considering supporting an organization that's positioned to work in an effective area, really do some research. The Center for Disaster Philanthropy can help you with that research, and we're truly just a phone call or an email away. I do want to start to wind us on down because we're heading quickly toward the top of the hour. In order to respect everyone's time, this really is all the time we have for today's webinar. So I wanted to extend a huge round of thanks to Dennis, Sara, Eric, and Nancy for taking the time to share your insights. I also want to give a special thanks to all of our co-sponsors, Foundation for Louisiana, Iowa Council on Foundations, Kansas Association of Community Foundations, Minnesota Council Foundations, the Mississippi Alliance of Nonprofits and Philanthropy, Wisconsin Philanthropy Network, Council on Foundations, Native Americans in Philanthropy, Sustainable Agricultural and Food Systems Funders, the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities. And thank you to all of you who joined us on the line today. If you have questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar, as I said before, we're just a phone call or an email away. You can email them to me at regine.webster@disasterphilanthropy.org. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it's listed here on the screen. And I just want to leave with this last thought of really thanking you all so much for your interest in this important topic. Thank you so much.